Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, good day to everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar on CCUS policy framework and deployment mechanism in India. My name is Juho Lipponen. I'm coordinator of the Clean Energy Ministerial CCUS initiative, and this is the host organization for the event. And today's topic is very exciting indeed. We'll be talking about India, we'll be talking about CCUS and CCUS policy for India. The policy side has received relatively little attention, I think, in the discussion so far. So we're really looking forward to bringing you this topic and a very recent key piece of analysis today. Here's today's agenda. In a second, I will hand over to one of my country co-leads in the CEM initiative, Sami, for a welcome on behalf of the CEM CCUS. And after that, we will hear today's presentation given by Atanu Mukherjee from Dastur Energy. And we will retain some time for questions after that. So please pose your questions, put them through the Q&A tab. And thank you all so much for your time. And with this, I'll hand over to you, Sami.
Thank you very much, Juho, and everyone, dear colleagues and friends. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar hosted by the Clean Energy Ministerial CCUS initiative. My name is Sami Al-Materi from Saudi Arabia, and my government is one of the 4 co-leads of the CEM CCUS initiative, together with Norway, the UK, and the US. A bit of a background in myself. I work with the Saudi Ministry of Energy, overseeing climate change policies, as well as accelerating clean energy technologies. As you know, the Clean Energy Ministerial, or what we call it, the CEM, is a global process to accelerate the deployment of the clean energy. And CEM, as you can see here, has 29 member countries across the world, and over 90% of global clean energy investments happen within these countries. But also, these countries represent 75% of the global CO2 emission. So this is a very relevant global partnership. Next slide. Under the CEM CCUS umbrella, there are over 20 different work streams, including your host, the CEM CCUS initiative. And this is a group of 14 CEM countries with the objective to accelerate carbon capture together. And our 14 members all have significant CCUS programs in place. And through this international collaboration, we share best practices and help each other to accelerate CCUS solutions. Today's webinar is about India, and we're really excited about the increased attention that the government and many other actors in India are giving to CCUS as one of the solutions in the decarbonization toolkit. So large-scale deployment, as you know, of CCUS in India is very vital, not just only for India itself, but also globally. And we know that technical research and even first projects are already happening in India. But so far, there has been little attention to the policy framework that allow large-scale deployment of CCUS in India. This will therefore be really interesting to hear about today's talk in CCUS policy and deployment mechanism for India. And the analysis that we will hear about has been commissioned by Niti Aayog, which is the planning organization within Indian government, chaired by India's Prime Minister. We really welcome this work done by India, and our CEM CCUS platform stands ready to help India move forward with CCUS. Today's presentation will be given by Mr. Atanu Mukherjee, the CEO of Dastur Energy. Atanu is the lead author of the report and obviously is better placed than anyone to give us today's presentation. The presentation by Atanu will take about 20 minutes, after which we'll have time for questions and answers. Atanu, welcome to this webinar, and really happy to have you with us. And thanks to you and to everyone joining us today. And I think now it's about time Attorney, welcome again, and over to you.
Thank you, Sami. Thank you, Yuho, for arranging for this presentation on the policy framework for carbon capture, utilization, and storage in India. And I think that it's fair to say that it has been some times of effort over the past year that led to the development of this framework, based on discussions that were started by us and by different experts internationally, as well as the government of India, specifically NITI Aayog, which is the main planning body under the chairmanship of the Prime Minister of India to shape the direction of policy in India. And so carbon capture, utilization, and storage is one of the important facets that's been recognized as a tool and option for decarbonizing India's emissions over the period of many decades and getting to net zero by 2070, as promised and as committed by the Prime Minister in his recent COP meetings. So I think just a brief background. Dastur, we are basically a business and engineering firm which has been there, operating out of India for the last many years, and now globally for the past many decades. And we essentially undertake these kind of studies by combining expertise and experience, from across the world. So with that, Yuho, if you can go to the next slide, that would be helpful. And so if you look at, the general objective and framework for developing the CCUS policy of India, the idea was to look at essentially, an overall framework focusing on various possible technologies, and I think more importantly, right, how do you figure out a viable model, a viable economic model for adoption and implementation, right? And I think it's important to stress the two parts, adoption and implementation at scale, and deployment at scale with a viable economic model, the technologies which are commercially viable, right? When I say possible technologies, we talked about viable technologies which are at levels of what we call as TRL, right, or maturity, which are higher on the scale so that adoption and deployment becomes faster. And so if you look at the general approach that we took, we obviously thought that it was very important to look at the international approaches by different countries in terms of CCUS. And I think it was important to understand the learnings, both in terms of successes and failures, right, on how we could utilize that from different countries around the world to shape the CCUS policies, and certainly inputs from Europe and inputs from the policy framework of the United States have been very helpful in taking some of the policy directions that we have recommended or suggested out here as a policy framework. I think there was also the second step, which was important to understand, was to look at the different CO2 sources, from a perspective of emissions and from a perspective of capturability, and look at capture mechanisms and disposition pathways. And therefore, the idea was not to look at just capture, but look at the entire value chain, right? And so when we look at the CCUS framework, as I think has been followed in other countries too, we look at the complete value chain, which starts from capture, which is basically sources, to processing, which can be of different types of processing depending upon the type of capture. And finally, in terms of utilization, transportation, utilization, and storage. And so being able to optimize the entire value chain becomes very important from a macro level policy perspective for CCUS to be adopted at a scale which is desirable and which is required, right, for the abatement of CO2 in a country like India, which will be pretty I think, extensive emitter on an absolute scale over the next many decades to come as it goes forward. I think one of the things that we thought would be useful to look at, along with NITI Aayog, was to really focus on the financing mechanism, which I think is important. and being able to really finance this in a way which is acceptable and which makes practical and pragmatic sense was useful. And so we looked at a financing mechanism and a risk minimization mechanism, which makes sense. And finally, of course, that resulted in a policy framework, which was presented to MITI and the ministries, right, in the past few weeks. We'll go forward, hopefully, as a policy level tool in the cabinet now over the next few months. Next one, you. So looked at different CCU policies around the world, like, and here's a snapshot. Canada, United States, UK, and Europe, specifically EU ETS systems, looked at different mechanisms of capture and disposition from a perspective of scale and deployment, hubs and clusters, which I'll talk a little bit about. A little bit of work with the LETS in Australia, and I think some of the work around. I think a lot of the recommendations and the analysis have drawn quite a bit from the United States 45Q tax credits and the mechanism, right, of NCF in California to look at how to shape the policy direction for India going forward, given the stage of development the country is at this point of time. Next one, Yeho. And so here are two, as you all know probably, the two most impactful policy instruments, which essentially tries to establish a price on carbon through different mechanisms. Right? One is a credits-based policy where you're incentivizing, development of a CCUS infrastructure or development of carbon abatement mechanisms, and the second is a tax-based policy, which is mostly prevalent in Europe. And we found that it probably makes more sense to look at a credits-based policy, right, for a developing part of India, given the political, social, economic ramifications that it might have initially based on a tax-based policy. So I think we looked at the two aspects of emissions trading. In EU, looked at the tax credit equity trading as a mechanism, right, for the credit-based policy. Here's some examples. We got 45Q. We got the SD plus scheme is probably like in Netherlands is similar to what we call an incentive-based policy with a cap. CFD is another what you call mechanism in Europe that is similar, where it's an incentive where you are basically got a strike price and you pay the difference in strike price and the market price. And I think of course the ETS-based systems, right, and the tax-based systems in Europe, most of the European countries. And then here's some numbers in terms of the subsidy examples, 45Q tax, where we look at 85 USD for a storage incentive, 60 USD for a CO2 EOR incentive and conversion incentive. And of course, if you look at European ETS system, which also establishes the price, we talk about 90 euros today, of course, in terms of transport CO2. So looking at all these things, we thought that it'll be useful to look at carbon credits-based policy, which incentivizes CCUS adoption, and is very directed. Any incentives policy is not a macro level policy from a perspective of all sources, but is very directed towards, you can direct it towards a specific mechanism like CCUS. So therefore, it will help establish the market and product of CCUS. And of course, you can have financial instruments designed to be able to allow you, to offset the carbon capture costs with financial instruments and future tax growth, right? And so we thought that it will be more suitable initially to start off with, to go with decarbonization using the industrial asset base, using an incentive-based system. And then, effectiveness of carbon tax-based policy is something that's very good, but it may not directly incentivize CCUS, right? And so that's something we thought might be also hazardous from perspective of economic and political landscape in India, given the state of the economy and the political expediency and the ramifications of that. And finally, of course, there's this whole apprehension, as you might know in Europe, for example, that there could be industrial migration and deindustrialization. So balancing both these things, what we thought, and if you can go to the next slide, just kind of like the conclusion on the policy measure, we thought that a carbon credits-based policy with corresponding mechanisms of trade over time would be very useful, and so you utilize that as a basic starting point to kickstart the accelerated adoption of industrial scale CCUS. And then move towards an emissions trading-based, tax-based policy over time, right? As CCUS takes hold as a part of the overall carbon abatement mechanism in the economy. So I think those were the basic motivators in terms of looking at a fundamental tenet or pillar in terms of how we go about defining the mechanism that we want to adopt to move forward in terms of CCUS policy framework going forward. You heard the next one if you can. Okay, so here's the again, I think a lot of you know this, but I just want to reemphasize that the fundamental 70% challenge that in the world, right, has not got to do with electricity, right? Not so much. It's certainly electricity is a big part of the entire decarbonization challenge, but that's a lesser of a challenge, I would think, given the developments in renewables and the developments that's happening in the different spaces of battery technology and storage. And so I think we're getting there in terms of electricity. So electricity, again, is 30% approximately of the total emissions in the world. And that is the case in India too, by the way, right? It's about a little more, 35 to 37%. But the decarbonization challenge, therefore, is not about decarbonizing electricity sector only. It is about looking at the other sectors which are hard to abate. And so if you look at the industry in the globally, it's about 31% of emissions. If you look at India, 3 gigatons, it's about similar, 31-32%. It's probably going to grow going over time. And there's other difficult sectors like agriculture, right, and transport. And so if you look at the strategy from a CCUS role perspective, how we justify this for India was to look at how do we really address this challenge of decarbonizing the growing industrial sector, as the economy grows at about 6 to 7 to 8% of GDP growth over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And how do you address that, right? And also given the fact that there are challenges in terms of energy security and industrial security, specifically accentuated with the happenings in Europe in the past decade or so, in the past 1 year or so, it is important to look at that aspect too on energy security and how do you drive a low carbon economy using resources from within the country. And so we thought that the country thought that the CCUS is a solution for decarbonizing large sectors of the economy while really leveraging resources that the nation has got in the most effective manner. Next one, please. And I think so. Here's a quick snapshot we looked at, from a CO2 source analysis perspective, like I showed in the first slide. Look at the generation, thermal power generation, right? And again, it is significant, right, in terms of its emissions because most of it is coal-fired generation at this point of time. And I think that's something that's going to go down over time, but we don't think it's going to go down substantially given the growth parameters that are in India. So that's going to go to about 1,200 million tons, or it's quite a bit going to 2030. Look at steel; it's significant. Steel is going to be one of the largest emitters, right? And CCUS is the only probably large-scale deployment mechanism that can be applied towards steel. Given the nature of assets that we have got in a developing country like India and the way it's growing. Cement, another one, it's got a large emission factor going up to about over 300 million tons, in 2030. And so on and so forth, if you look at it. And I think it's important to look at hydrogen and coal gasification, because much as we would like to have coal go away, I think the challenge is really not about the source of emission, right? It's not about coal or oil or gas or solar or wind. Right? It's about the CO2. It's about CO2 and how do you really address CO2 as a challenge. And therefore, if you look at India from a perspective of the Prime Minister and the nation, utilizing scarce energy resources in the most effective manner, scarce affordable energy resources in the most effective manner is an important part of the entire nation's strategy. And so coal gasification is one of the major pathways which will help in energy security by taking vast amounts of coal India's got and hopefully turning them through coal gasification into a carbon neutral and carbon abated manner into industrial chemicals, into crude substitutes, and therefore will allow you to really create the framework and the envelope for energy security and material security to a large degree, right? So we're going to take these realities into consideration in a country like India. And of course, hydrogen is an important piece. And it's not only going to be hydrogen in terms of just hydrogen electrolysis, given the technical economics of it and the evolution of that over time. It's important to look at hydrogen from perspective of how can we utilize fossil sources and use carbon capture to be able to kickstart the entire hydrogen economy, so that it can really then welcome the green hydrogen economy as and when it becomes techno-economically feasible and viable. So I think a lot of thought had to do with how do you look at the economics, how do you look at the challenges, how do you look at the energy security, how do you look at the material security, and how do you combine this together to frame a policy framework which makes sense for a country like India, which is in a development path, right, over the next hopefully many decades. Next one, if you can. And so here's what we looked at. Importance of basically looking at the sources and enabling the value chain. And enabling the value chain is the most important thing, right? So it's from capture to transport to processing, and then to different forms of utilization and disposition. And so here's some numbers broad numbers that we found based on the business analysis, but it can again vary depending upon the situation. But those broad numbers kind of like work, we think. I think there's a lot of focus in any country, any situation, to look at how can we convert this, right, CO2 into useful things. Right? And I think while that's a very laudable goal, scientific, technological, economic, limitations tell you that you cannot convert everything away, right, into products which can be useful. You can convert some, which may be about 4 to 5% of total CO2, capturable CO2, but you cannot convert much. So one of the Indian government policy framework requirements was to look at how can we drive the change, right, in terms of conversion. And so we looked at that, right, and design incentives to drive that forward. But storage is going to be a mainstay, right, in terms of really CCUS and the value chain. Next one, Yeho, if you can. Okay, and so here's some technologies we looked at, and I think it's safe to say that we looked at technologies which make sense, right, from a practical deployment and implementation perspective, right? So mostly in pre-combustion and post-combustion. Don't want to go to the details, right? I'm happy to talk about it later, right? But basically, standard technologies are matured and can scale and deploy fast, which are got to do with physical solvent-based and chemical solvent-based technologies. Got to do with adsorption, physical and chemical adsorption, and cryogenic technology, and to some degree membrane. We have not looked at DAC in this because DAC is emerging, and it's unlikely that it's going to be a major contributor, right, in terms of CCUS deployment and implementation in the near-term time frame of 10 years or so. Although that's a recommendation that we're given to really look at investing in R&D and investing in deployment, right, in pilots and DAC, right, over time. Next one, And I think, so here are some products that we looked at, right, to enable as a part of the policy. One was CO2 mineralization, which I think is very opportune in terms of carbonation of silicates and oxide and hydrates. Carbon to chemicals, specifically methanol, and it's a company that Iceland that you might know that is very successful in methanol from CO2. How do you enable that, right? And how do you enable biological conversion, which also, again, is pretty much in the lower scale at this point of time. But a lot of the stuff in e-fuels from carbon to chemicals and CO2 mineralization can potentially be driven right to this policy, and there were incentives that we suggested in terms of driving this forward, specifically methanol and methanol derivatives and aggregate production, right, from CO2. Next one, Yeho. And if you look at India, it's got a lot of storage, right? And look at the storage capacity. Actually, the initial estimates indicate that anywhere from 395 to 600 GT of storage is available. And the question becomes, how do you really kind of like characterize that storage into actual implementable pore space? And that's something that we recommended. That first thing that India needs to do, like the United States has done and other countries have done for many years, to really characterize the geological modeling for the pore space, assess the potential, and then take pilot projects and then drive CO2 injection, right, at commercial scale demonstrations, which can be funded by the government for that matter, right? And so EOR, ECBMR, saline aquifers, and hopefully basaltic formations, right, are the ones that we can use into the pore space. You hold the next one. And so here's the way to think about it. And I think we do this from Europe, for example, work at Teesside cluster, the Humber cluster, the Rotterdam cluster, the Ship Channel cluster. The idea of being to be able to drive storage clusters at scale to be able to drive economies of scale is very important for CCU to succeed in terms of its cost structures and implementation structures. And so here's a map of how the storage structures can be organized once mapped into different regions based on intensity of CCUS emissions from the different fixed sources. And it seems to be pretty interesting in terms of what can emerge in terms of CCUS clusters and hubs, over a period of time, right, across different kinds of storage mechanisms that you've got. And largely you see saline aquifers are the main ones that we can, I think, really leverage on at this point of time. Next one. And so here's a hub and cluster-based exchange-based model, which we think is going to help enable CCUS, the value chain, right? And so one way to think about this whole thing is that if you incentivize something using something like a tax incentive or a cash incentive, then it'll be useful to establish the markets of carbon, through aggregation across the different CO2 sources, through disposition across different areas and conversions, and and injection of different kinds. And we chose our motivation was from the Henry Hub, where if you're able to enable hubs and clusters, you need to have a mechanism of trade, right? Which will establish basically a mechanism of trade and drive down, increase innovation, increase what you call adoption, at the same time drive down the cost, right, in terms of the cost of CO2. And therefore, we think that the hub and cluster model is very, very important in terms of enabling the entire value chain, right, over a period of time. Next one, Yoho. I think I'll just kind of quickly go through this. And I think the financing framework is important, right? And then people have not talked about it much, but here we think we looked at different mechanisms and we looked at how to do this. And we thought that the one way to do that would be to look at a centralized carbon capture finance corporation, right? Which is a semi-government, quasi-government financing vehicle, which draws its investments, right, based on its advantages, right, from different kinds of clean energy cess fund, from the budgetary support, as well as from external markets, and then utilizes that to fund, right, the operational and capital flows into the cash and tax credit incentives, and then utilize that to really drive the adoption of CCUS, as well as drive the adoption and growth of industries around CCUS, right, the new industries on CCUS, which then drives tax collection, which then drives what you call the fund, what you call closure. So I think we think this is a good mechanism to do that, and we find that this to be subsidy over time to be basically self-sustaining, right, depending upon how the investments are made. Next one, Yoho, and I think. Okay, and so what's the policy framework for CCUS? I think basically what you're saying is that the policy path is going to be a credits-based policy. That's a recommendation in the near term, and to carbon tax in the future over time. Right? We need to have financing mechanisms for CCUS projects, and I think the Carbon Capture Finance Corporation is an important piece of the whole thing. We need to have markets. We could have CO2 markets, with storage markets or whether it's markets for conversion. And a hub and cluster model based on economies of scale and trade will really drive integration of emitters and aggregators, hub operators, and disposal agents. And we think that economics really drives the business model well that way. Really look at how to drive low carbon products through preferential treatment in terms of product links incentives to foster innovation, right? Because they cannot initially compete with the incumbent products. Look at really the accounting and regulatory framework, and we looked at LCA. We recommended LCA as the basic framework for driving adoption. And finally, I think risk mitigation. Risk is a big thing, and how do you really drive CO2 reliability and ownership? And how do you drive MVA to drive reliability and ownership? And there's a whole body of work around ensuring that reliability, because reliability can be huge. And so being able to drive that through reinsurance mechanisms across international agencies is very important. And so finally, I think next one, Yoho, if I may, and then hopefully we can have some time for questions. So we think, and I think the government thinks true, that to be true too, is that CCUS is vital for sustainable growth, and like I said, tied to India's energy security from a perspective of energy, materials, and food. It is very important from a perspective of first steps to look at how do you look at the source, sink, and force-based mapping, and detailed characterization with international experience needs to be done right away, right? And it needs to be started. Some work has been done, but needs to be done much more. I think the whole hub and cluster model needs to be developed, like the ship channel model, right? In Houston is a starting point, or Rotterdam model, or Teesside model can be good input points. A risk management framework is very important, right, to be developed simultaneously. And of course, this needs to be driven through a essentially incentive-based policy, which is driven, financed with Carbon Capture Finance Corporation. And I think finally, we certainly have, we believe that continued technology transfer is important. It is important not to reinvent the wheel and really look at how we can take technology from countries which have developed it and are mature and utilize that and fund innovation in areas which is required. That way, you really drive the overall, economy, the CCUS economy over a period of time, and encourage participation from different quarters to make this happen, right? Hopefully, in a few decades. So I think hopefully that gives you a thumbnail, and with that I will stop. And I don't know, Yoho, have I exceeded my time, or am I on time, or are we doing okay? And
we're doing fine. Thank you very much, Atanu.
Okay.
Thank you. No, we've got nearly 15 minutes left for the questions and discussion. So many thanks indeed. A lot of content there, and there's been a few questions also in the Q&A. So we'll come to many of those in the next section now. Maybe just to make it a bit more convivial, we'll stop the slide share and just have the panel, if you like, here. And so myself and Sami will be grilling you, Atanu, regarding regarding the presentation. And maybe I'll kick off. So you've gone through a lot of different opportunities for CCUS in India. On many slides you showed reference to a lot of different sectors that could use it. In your mind, who might lead? Where might the first large-scale projects emerge in Indian context?
Yeah. So I think that one of the advantages that a country like India has is that it has got a large body of what is called as public sector units. It's basically state-owned corporations. Okay. And the state-owned corporations, is different from private enterprise, exactly like what's in the other parts of the world, other parts of the world where they've gone private. But in India, a lot of it is state-owned. And I think that is an advantage from a perspective of driving opportunities for CCUS implementation based on, I don't really use the word mandate, but based on directives. Okay. So for example, a company like Indian Oil Corporation, right, which is a large refinery, and where we did some work, they have been doing some initial mapping on CCUS, right, in terms of how to make their refineries cleaner, especially the hydrogen generation units, right, and use EOR along with another state body called ONGC, Oil and Natural Gas Commission, right, which has got this, the subsurface area, and combine that together to drive what we call some of the initial CCUS deployment at large scale. Similarly, large-scale state steel plants like Steel Authority of India, right, is another very opportune, entity which can get a directive or a mandate to drive adoption, right? So I think it's the state-owned units called the PSUs, which will lead the charge, and this is a very good thing in a way because you don't have necessarily just a shareholder or a profit incentive to drive it, but it's also driven by the mandate from the government, which dovetails well with the policy.
Thank you. Sami.
Yeah, thank you, Atanu, very much. Very wonderful presentation. Maybe a question is more about whether India have initiatives to start further qualifying the potential CO2 storage sites in India. And if yes, what about the strategic hubs in India? Where do you think might be the potential of strategic hubs in India?
Right. So I think that is the most important parameter or factor at this point of time to drive CCUS, right? To characterize the port space, right? There has been some work that has been done till date in terms of broad macro level characterization through a body called the National Center for Carbon Capture. It's been established under the Ministry of Science and Technology, right, in Bombay, called IIT, Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. There's been work that's been done since 2008 in some amount of mapping, right? Mostly satellite mapping, right? And some amount of mapping, physical mapping, by the British Geological Society, right? Some time back. There's been some work by UT Austin on satellite mapping, right? And all these indicate that there's large space, but exact characterization is still lacking. Specifically, if you look at the areas where it's available, looks to be available, right, in terms of large amounts. One is the Gulf of Cambay, which is in the western part of India called Gujarat. Then there's Bombay High offshore region, right? Offshore oil production region. It's another area. There's also shallow offshore in the eastern side called Haldia, which is another area. There's certainly geographical pockets, right, for saline aquifers and potential ECBMR in the eastern part of India, right? So I think there's sufficient, looks like there's sufficient amount of pore space that is available. It needs to be characterized for further implementation. If you look at the emergence of the clusters, we think that will be mostly the west to start with. It'll be mostly the west, where there's a lot of industrial concentration, right, in Gujarat, where the Gulf of Cambay storage structure is potentially available, and eastern India, which is mostly a lot of heavy manufacturing like steel, which is concentrated, and Haldia offshore, for example, is another opportune area in Bay of Bengal available, apart from the onshore vertical structure. So about 4 clusters over time, right? 4 or 5 clusters over time is probably what it's going to be, like I showed on the map earlier.
Building on that, Atanu, I mean, you mentioned that there has been a lot of technical work done by India, academic level, also some smaller project. But then to move to that level of having those hubs, having large scale projects in mind, who do you think is kind of or to be the prime mover here in the India context? Is this something that essentially government is going to drive, or do you also see industry having interest in driving these projects and hubs forward?
I think that world over, as you've seen, all these things are mostly driven by the government, right? Given the nature of these projects, given the nature of scale that you've got, nature of investments, and the uncertainty, but the nature of returns that you've got, right? So private sector can be a participant, right, as it is, right, in other parts, right? But it needs to be driven by the government of any entity, and for that matter, India too. And I think given the directive by the Prime Minister, right, and the Prime Minister's office, right, who drives these strategic initiatives, I would imagine that this will be taken up by the Prime Minister's office in conjunction with, of course, the ministries, specific ministries, to what you call take the implementation or drive the implementation forward, which will in turn draw in, right, the different kind of participants from the private sector. We don't think, and we have not seen anywhere in the world where private sector is a fundamental driver, right, of these initiatives, given the large scale and given the nature of uncertainty that is involved, right, in these projects, and the nature of returns that is involved in these projects. So I think that's going to be the case out here too. I think the whole thing around mapping, for example, if you look at the work in the United States, from by CCARB, the RCSPs, right, over the past 15, 20 years has been remarkable, right? And there's been remarkable success, right? I think the whole thing around the DOE work that's been done, the whole work in Europe that's been driven by Horizon project, for example, the CEF project has been going on for the timing, just transition. So I think a lot of it needs to be driven, right, from the government, which will draw in the participation of the private sector over time, which then kickstart the entire, the virtual cycle of the CCUS economy, as I call it.
Maybe if I add Yoho to this, I had a question, but maybe you pretty much answered that, Tony, about who should take the lead. I think you clearly mentioned that the government should definitely take the lead into this, to be the primary movers of CCUS in India. Maybe I have a question, Yoho, if you allow me. There are various international groups like the CEM CCUS, as you know, and the Asia CCUS network. What do you think India could draw from experience in other countries?
I think huge. Okay, and that's one of the recommendations of our analysis, is that draw upon the experiences, right, of other countries, right. I would call out the United States. I would call out some of the work that's been done in Norway, for example. Early work in Norway in CCUS. I think the first one in Sleipner and Snowit, for example. You know, I think there's a lot of experience and body of knowledge in this. It is imperative for this, for that body of knowledge and experience to be assimilated and applied for CCUS to move forward in India. Otherwise, I think it's going to be very difficult, right, from a time frame perspective, from an assimilation perspective, from a success perspective. So it is an imperative measure that the government of India needs to drive forward, which we have recommended, to be able to really assimilate different bodies, right, from different parts of the world who are experiencing this, and apply that towards the accelerated, you know, analysis and deployment of CCUS in India. So I think that's very important. And also, like I said, it's important to look at not developing technologies. And again, I don't want to say this loud, but say this specifically that way. But generally, a lot of countries, developing countries, have got this tendency to develop technologies themselves, which is a good thing, right? But you know, there are a lot of technologies in the CCUS space that are very mature and developed, right? And we need to draw upon that, right? And to apply that, right, those mature technologies to accelerate the deployment and apply your resources, apply resources of innovation in new technologies in other areas, like probably in DAC areas, probably in the conversion. So I think this synthesis of being able to really draw in international expertise, international experience into the entire fold is fundamentally important for success for CCUS at scale.
Thanks, Atanu. That's really good points there, and especially not reinventing the wheel, but drawing from experience by others and various groups. You know, you can cite you know, CSLF and IEA Greenhouse Gas Program and International CCS Knowledge Center and GCCSI. There's a lot of expertise out there, which I'm sure is at the disposal of Indian organizations going forward, so that we don't have to go reinventing the wheel. In the Q&A tab, very interesting question here. What's the policy framework actually now? Does India have to create everything from scratch, or are there elements of the policy that kind of would already exist?
Yeah, so I think there are some policies that are useful to look at, right? And we looked at. So there's been a history of policy frameworks around something called PLI, production-linked incentives, right, in India. So if you look at one of the recent ones, which is got to do with ethanol production, and it's basically bioethanol production, right? The whole market for bioethanol in India has taken off in the past 5 to 7 years, right? Because of the policy on bioethanol, which is basically a incentive subsidy, right, for bioethanol to compete with standard incumbent ethanol markets. And that's just taken off, right, dramatically, right, in the past few years. So I think there are similar production-linked incentives that have been successful. There's a whole body of work that's been done on methanol economy in terms of, again, a PLI, production-linked incentive on methanol production from different sources, fossil fuel sources. So I think that body of work exists, and there's experience in that, implementing that, right, at scale. So we certainly can draw that. I don't think there's been work on CCUS policy till now. There's been some pilots, some work, right? There's been some talks, and I think generally speaking, the general awareness about CCUS as a major driver for abatement was rather limited, right, till of late. And so it's taken a little while, right, for us to get there. So there's not much of a body of work on CCUS policy. There's some pilots work that's been going on in CCUS at this point of time at different parties. So I think the CCUS policy can build on some of this PLI framework that's been there working, right, and draw upon that. There's also work on carbon exchange markets that's been worked on, and the Bureau of Energy Efficiency working on exchange markets, which you can draw upon. So utilizing that, we can synthesize, right, a CCUS policy along with what we've suggested, right, going forward. So I think it's not all blank slate. It's some amount of work which can be done.
Excellent. Look, with taking the risk of abusing people's time a little bit, I think there's one really interesting question as well that we could finish with, Atanu, very quickly. What do you see as the biggest challenges in starting in deploying CCUS in India?
Yeah, so I think the biggest challenge is first organizing, right, the government anchor to drive this. So I think being able to drive that as an anchor strategic national initiative, right, driven to the PMO is the first thing, right, which I think is being worked on right now as we speak. I think there's a meeting on 23rd of December where all the ministries and the Prime Minister's office are getting together to drive this forward, right? So that's one. Second, I think, is the force space mapping. That is fundamentally important, right, in terms of being able to really take this forward. How do we map the force space? And we need to do it in an accelerated manner. Third is to really drive, the financing mechanism, right? Very clear financing mechanism, very clear incentive mechanism, which then drives adoption, right, in the private sector, over time. So those three are the key challenges, I would say. Technology is not a challenge. I think general implementation over time is not that a challenge. These three, I think, are the main things that you need to work on look at. Take this forward.
Very good. Excellent. 3 points, always easy to retain, and gives great indication as to where we should go next. So thank you very much, Atanu. And ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, with this, I think we have to bring the event to a close. The recording of this event will be available on the CEM website and on a YouTube channel in a couple of days. So we'll send you the link to that recording once it is up. And our CEM initiative also is present on LinkedIn and Twitter, so you can look us up and follow us if you're interested, and email us at info@cemccus.org if you have questions. So finally, 3 times thanks, Atanu. First of all, thanks so much for sharing the report, for the insights on this really, really ultra important topic. And I know that we will be in touch going forward.
Thank you, Yo. Thank you, Sami. Thank you, everybody. Back to you later.
And Sami, thank you for co-hosting the event. Most great. And everybody out there, last but not least, thanks for your time today, and hope this has been useful. So enjoy the end of year festivities and be in touch in the new year, and bye for now.
Bye.